DP1.1 of Unit 4, Area Study 1. We're looking at consciousness as a psychological construct. Now I'm going to highlight what you need to know. You need to know, by definition, what is psychological construct? How does that lead into definition of consciousness? Okay, so you do need to know what psychological construct is, what is consciousness, and then, as part of your language, as you're defining it, you need to use the words like continuum. You do need to know normal waking consciousness versus altered states of consciousness, naturally versus induced. Okay, so I've just highlighted some of the words and things that we're going to be going through. So in terms of my number of slides, essentially that's what I'm cutting through. Okay? Now, let's start off. Very simple as an idea. Consciousness. If we had to describe it in our own understanding, what is consciousness? Your own definition. If I asked you, what is consciousness, what would you say? What is consciousness? It's a key word that we can think of. Isabel? State of being aware. Literally, what you just said, being aware. So awareness links with consciousness. But now this is where the study kind of comes into the idea. How do you know that consciousness, or how do you know that you're aware of something? How do you prove that there is such thing as awareness? And that's what this study is going to be. So here's an example. If I asked you now to be mindful, let's be aware of our current surrounding. Can anyone hear a constant sound in the background that's currently running? Okay, now we do. But did you hear it before? No. But it was always there. The sound of this heater has been on this whole time. And if we actually tune our ears, maybe we can probably put our attention to something outside of this room as well, if we wanted to. But the amount of noise has always been here. Okay? So what's interesting, or even if you want to listen to people's typing, or when they're writing, why is it that now we're aware, we're conscious of it being there? That's what's interesting. Now, René Descartes is a French philosopher who coined this idea at the start. Because what he believed, which he calls dualism, those who are interested in philosophy, the idea is that, is the mind and the body one entity, or is it separate? So you, as a person, if I ask Mark, you, which is this body that I see, Mark is, you're sitting in front of me, you've got short black hair, is that Mark? Or is the mind Mark, which makes you your decision, what you're about to say to me? What your strengths are, what you believe who you are. Is that two separate things? Or is it one separate, a one togetherness? Because if Mark as a mind is separate, then what's the body? Who's the body? And this is where, philosophically, I know, it's really crazy, isn't it? René Descartes believed that there is a difference. And in one of the famous quotes, it's the idea, the mind and body are separate. And yet one influences the other. So one happens, as one changes, the other changes as well. And what's interesting is that he brought upon this idea that yes, you can have a mind, but it's actually that mind is actually separate from the body. You can actually move your body because it's the mind that starts it. It's not actually one and the same, is what he proposed. When we moved into where we're at now in a sort of a psychological sense, then we talk about James Williams or William James. He's the one who talks about our mindset, consciousness. He believed it was more of a stream, is how he described it. That our mindset, there's never a time that your conscious awareness is ever off. As you're sitting here, as you're listening to me, there will be moments where you weren't listening to me. There would have been moments you might have been thinking, oh, who's Descartes? Or you might be like, that sounds like dessert. What am I going to eat for dessert? Maybe in that moment as you're listening to me, you're not actually 100% here. There are moments where your mind kind of wanders. And that wandering happens throughout the day, whether you're aware of it or you're not aware of it. That's what consciousness is. What's the problem? How do we know it exists? It seems like it's this idea that I brought upon you, but how do you prove it? How do you prove that we have consciousness? And this leads us into the first explanation, or not explanation, but we're going to define as much as we can. So this is a picture of René Descartes. Descartes, and he proposed the theory of dualism. So the mind and the body in the world comprised of two differing aspects, material elements, which is our body, and he believed in the existence space and a thinking component that had no physical location. This is the key part. That's your consciousness. It doesn't have a location, because if I can pinpoint it, can I just stab the occipital lobe and then you have no consciousness? Or where does consciousness exist? We can say where the body exists. I can say Mark's sitting over there. But if Mark is the mind, then where is Mark? Okay, so it's a very philosophical question. Now, what we do know is that, okay, we understand that the mind can control the body. There are times that you can say to yourself, you can get a cut and you don't even feel it if you didn't even know. Sometimes you get a paper cut and you don't even realize you had a paper cut until you see it and you're like, oh, I have a paper cut. And then it hurts, right? This is a very interesting concept because that's showing body and mind are two separate things. Because if it's one, then you should have felt it when you got the cut. But you didn't feel it. You only saw it when you only felt the pain until you saw it. So that means that the interpretation of it in your mind has to be separate from the body. The problem with it is that the mind, the consciousness, doesn't have a way to measure. So how do we even study consciousness? How is there even a chapter or DP on this idea of consciousness overall? Well, by definition, we got to first understand what a psychological construct is. So in your notes, you should have somewhere, you need to understand this concept here. What is a psychological construct? Psychological construct, unlike physical characteristics, like, you know, your hair, how tall you are, what you look like, those you can see. Psychological construct cannot be directly observed. Okay, just like consciousness. It is existing. We believe it exists. We believe there is such thing of being aware about something and not being aware of something. The problem is it cannot be directly observed. So, a psychological construct is a concept that is constructed to describe specific psychological activity or a pattern of activity that is believed to occur or exist but cannot be directly observed. Now that sounds totally crazy, but just to help you understand, a psychological construct is broken up into three things. You can only assess overall awareness, like how do I know that you're aware of something, is I may ask you to self-report it. So I might say, if everyone closed their eyes at the moment, and I want you to be then aware of your breath. So are you breathing in fast or are you breathing in slow? So you breathe in. Are you consciously aware that it's actually going through? If you pay attention to that airway, from the nose to the throat, to your lungs, to maybe the center of your chest, and then you let out, can you feel and see that moment as the air goes? That's consciousness. You're being aware. But how did I know that? How did I know evidence of awareness? I did the first one. Number one, information provided by individual. I'm asking you, did you feel it? Did you see it? Can you smell it? Did you hear that sound? You see, I'm doing number one, which is a psychological construct, a concept that I'm describing specific psychological activity. So I'm using something like this, and I'm asking you a question, and I'm pulling that together to say, this is evidence of awareness. Even though awareness or consciousness cannot be directly observed. I'm asking you if you can feel that. I can't see it, but I can ask you. Number two, your behavior that is demonstrated. Consciousness, so often I can see those who are actually there. Sometimes I'm standing, I'm talking, and I see a student looking at me, but they're actually not there. I know they're actually somewhere else. They're just staring at me. I'm like, yeah, that kid's gone. They're probably thinking about something else, right? And then I might say, and what's interesting, I just did it with my year 8s before. He was staring at me, and I was like, question 1B, question 1B, question 1B, question 1B, and finally he came back, and his eyes kind of darted left and right, and then he looked at me, and like, question 1B, and he's like, 1B, and I'm like, yes, 1B, that's what we're doing now. So what's interesting, that how did I know that the student, though he was looking at me, how did I know that consciousness was not there? He was somewhere else. How did I know that? Behavior that is described or showed, demonstrated. That's how I know. Okay, whether you're attentive or not, whether your awareness is there. And that's what we're going to talk about later, about different stages of consciousness. And then your final one here is physiological changes that can be measured. So for example, your heart rate, your brain activity, which now we can measure your brain activity when you're doing, I don't know, puzzles. They can actually see the level of consciousness to actually look at the different regions of activity, whether you're engaged or you're not engaged. But back then, when Descartes proposed the idea, they didn't have this measurement. This was only something that they were proposing as an idea that maybe the mind and body are separate. And we are now at a point where we're thinking, yeah, actually, we can probably measure such thing as this idea of consciousness through what we call a psychological construct, broken up into 3 parts. So you do need to know these as part of your notes. When you're describing consciousness, you got to refer to psychological construct, which is the concept that is to describe specific psychological activity, so the mind, what's happening in our mind, but through a pattern of activity that is believed to occur or exist but cannot be directly observed. Okay? Now, that's what a psychological construct is. So if we know that the mind and consciousness is something that exists, but we can't see it, how do we measure it? Well, we pull these things together, either do a self-report, or we do questioning the individual, or we watch what the individual does, or we measure physiological changes. Those are the things that we can have inferences, and that's a key word that I'm using. Inferences. Did I write it down here? No, I didn't have it. I'm just going to write it up here. We're using all of this as an inference. So we're referring to, based on these pieces of puzzles together, to then say this must mean a level of awareness. Okay, so we're inferencing, we're inferring. So consciousness, what is consciousness as a definition? This is actually still the same even 10 years ago when I did psychology when I was in high school, actually more than 10 years ago. These 4 terminologies or points about consciousness you must have. That hasn't changed since forever. All right, so consciousness can be defined as our awareness of objects and events in the external world. So what we can see, I'm aware that there's a sound, I'm aware that someone's talking, and then you can also think about consciousness of internal. Are you aware when you're angry? When you're about to say something wrong? Are you aware that you're jealous of something that you're envious of? Are you aware that you're coming in not feeling 100%? How do you know that? How do you become aware? So awareness, they talk about not only the external world, but also the sensations, the mental experiences, and own existence at any given moment. Okay? Now it is an experience. Consciousness is an experience as you're going through it, hence why we can't objectify it. And then these are the 4 key things or properties or characteristics of consciousness. Personal, your own unique, subjective, and private understanding. Continuous, it is continuous. There is this never a time when you are awake when your consciousness is empty. The idea that consciousness or awareness never stops. Even when you're sleeping, there is a level of consciousness somewhere. Whether you're dreaming, whether you're, I don't know, there's always a stream of mindset that your mind is on this forever film that continues to roll. Whether you're aware of it or you're unaware of it, it's still running. Okay? So that's the idea of continuity. Changing. Your awareness changes. How does it change? My finger, when I pointed to the screen, you might have just looked at the screen. When I point up, or you might look back at me, maybe I raise my intonations. That changes your focus. I may do a song and dance and suddenly I catch your attention, or I say, hey, look over there, and then that changes the direction. So our mindset is always changing, or our focus or awareness is constantly changing. From my sound to someone else talking, to someone, whether you're looking at your screen, to the sound of your phone, to maybe your friend just sitting next to you breathing heavily. That is changing. And then finally, selective. What is consciousness? Well, one of the things that we know, you're only aware of it if you selectively pay attention to it. Okay, so selective, you are able to voluntarily choose the focus of your attention. And that's essentially what breaks down what we're going to be going through today, consciousness overall. Well, what have you got so far? In your notes, as you're going through my OneNote PowerPoints, you should have definition of psychological construct. You should have an idea of what consciousness is and where it started from, which we've got René Descartes, and then it followed on with William James. Here we go. So the rest after consciousness is really almost self-explanatory from here. You've got what we call states of consciousness. So obviously there are different levels of awareness. There are times, and this is what they call normal, and we'll play a video later, and I'll just play it in the background if you're interested in listening. There is a philosophical perspective or a biological perspective. So you can listen to either one of those people talking about consciousness. Okay? Now, before we do those practice questions there, we know that consciousness is a continuum. So we know that you can be aware at certain levels. You can either be really focused, or you could be really deflated in focus, or absolutely not focused at all. Okay? So you're not totally aware, you're unconscious about it. Now, consciousness is broken up into two sections that you need to know the difference between, and you need to describe. So consciousness is a continuum. Normal waking consciousness is the level that you operate on a daily basis. Things that you're aware of. So it refers to the states of consciousness associated with being awake and aware of objects and events. So you're in this classroom right now. You know today is a Monday. You're in a psychology class. You know Mr. Tran is talking. That is normal waking consciousness. So you know the one sensations, mental experiences, and own existence. It is the state of experience during a period of wakefulness. Now, 2/3 of each day is in normal waking consciousness. So there's a third where you're not, is what they believe. Okay? So there's a third where you might tune out. There's a third where you're sleeping. There's a third where you are absolutely beyond the normal waking consciousness. So when we think of consciousness or awareness, it's not like consciousness is up here and then you're unaware. Consciousness is in the middle, and we call it when you're actually super focused. Let's say when you're studying, you're really there, you're really focused on each and every single word, which is much harder than what you normally do. When you're actually paying attention to something that you're really trying to learn and you're listening to it intentively, that is a different type of consciousness. You're not always operating like that. So we call that altered state of consciousness. So anything that's not normal. So this right now is normal. You're listening to me. You might be thinking about how much time is left. You might be thinking, what is consciousness again? What was he talking about, right? That is your normal conscious waking moment, your wakefulness. The moment when it drops, when you're fluctuating and it drops, you're totally unaware of what's going on. You're totally zoned out. You're doing something else. You're thinking about something else. That is below normal. That's called altered state of consciousness. But you can also be altered above. You can be totally fixated on something. You could be looking at a bird outside and you're really focused. You're awake. You're very full on concentrating about that bird, and that bird, how many wings it has, or how many feathers it has, what kind of color it has. You're really focused. I don't know how many wings. It has 5 wings maybe. So what you can see, altered state of consciousness, if you think about normal waking consciousness, is like the middle. It's like the middle band. And then altered is anything above concentration, and anything below normal concentration on that continuum is what it is. And that continuum just means at the very top of the chain, you're absolutely aware of everything. You're aware that you're currently moving. In my case, I'm moving my hand from right to left. I know that I'm speaking at 60 minutes per 60 words per minute. Like maybe that's the kind of level of awareness I have. That's total awareness. 2, very bottom, total lack of awareness. I am absolutely don't even remember anything. I don't even know what that section had happened. So this is more relevant to things like coma and beyond, right? Whilst asleep, you're kind of somewhat aware. Sometimes you remember your dreams. Okay, so as you move up the chain, this is a continuum, a meditative state, whereas also a altered state of consciousness. Because when you're in a meditative state, what are you doing? You are now focusing on your breath. You're focusing on relaxing your body to bring yourself to a different state. That requires effort. You're not always in that mode. That's called an altered state of consciousness. But anything else in between is your normal waking consciousness. Okay? So those are the 2 different terms there that you'll likely describe. Now, an altered state of consciousness, there are 2 categories that they break up into. They call it naturally occurring. Okay, so you're changing your state of consciousness, either naturally occurring or induced. What's naturally occurring? Falling asleep. That's something that's normal. You fall asleep, and that changes your level of consciousness. You're not aware of what I'm saying. If you fall asleep right now, what I just described in the next maybe 2 minutes, you may not hear. You're not attentive to it. You're not aware. So that's an altered state of consciousness that is naturally occurring. What about induced? Induced is, say, doing something like meditation, doing something like exercising, focus on something else, like you're doing deadlifts and it's the biggest PB that you've ever done. You'd really be focusing on every single strand of muscle before you do your lift. Or it could be alcohol induced, drugs. It could be an injury. You got a concussion. Your level of awareness is different. These are all called altered states of consciousness, but they're not two separate things. Yeah, so just because it's naturally and induced doesn't mean you can't have both. See, sleeping, as an example, that's a naturally occurring one. You can induce that. You can take medication to put you into drowsiness, to put you in an altered state of consciousness. So we're just describing the two. One's naturally occurring, one's induced, but they're not mutually exclusive. They can be together. Okay, so they can be occurring at the same time. You can induce through drugs to get somewhere that's naturally occurring. Okay, so this is a picture to give you an idea of that continuum, which you will need to copy down. So make sure to have that diagram when you do copy your notes. Level of awareness as it increases. What's your clarity of content? How aware are you? Drowsiness, and you see that where they overlap. That's the section where they're trying to say that you've got natural versus induced. They're about the same. Okay, so that's where the gray area is. So sleep is a natural, and I gave just an example there. Sleep is a natural occurring. ASC means altered states of consciousness, but can also be induced through medication to feel drowsiness. Okay. As your last part, and this part I reckon you can take on for yourself, but there's two types of attention that you need to know, and you might have heard of this before. Selective attention and divided attention. Yeah? Selected attention, obviously it's talking about you're only conscious of something if you can selectively choose what you want to pay attention to. And this is where it's interesting. You can be in a nightclub, but why is it possible with all the noises and all the people speaking? Why is it okay for you to still hear the person you're talking to? You can have a conversation during that time. How's that possible? And that's because it's possible because there's attention. You're able to discard every other information and only focus on what you want to. That's called selective attention. Okay? Then you've got your next part, which is called divided attention. Okay, so I've got all the notes there for you to sort of follow there. Divided attention, this is probably where the concept is, we don't believe that you can do two things complicated separately. Okay, so you can't drive, and this is why they're banning the idea of driving and using use of mobile phones, because entering a digit, say calling your girlfriend or boyfriend or partner or whoever it is, dialing the number and driving at the same time is a complexity. But what they found is you can do two things if they're very similar. If you're doing two things that are very similar, it is actually possible to put attention to it and do it okay. But it is not possible, or at least there's a decline in consciousness in multitasking. What they found that when people think that they can multitask, what they're really doing is they're selectively moving from one attention to the next. So they're moving simultaneously so quick that it seems like they're doing both at the same time, but they're not. They're just focusing on one. They're highly organized and structured, and that's where we're talking about divided attention. Okay, so divided attention refers to the ability to distribute our attention, undertake two or more activities simultaneously. So as an example, you could be listening to me right now, but it doesn't mean you're not aware it's raining outside. It doesn't mean that you're not aware that your laptop's on or your exercise book's in front of you. You know that. You're aware of who's sitting next to you, but you're listening to me. So that's an example of divided attention. You're still listening to what I'm saying, but it doesn't mean you totally have no idea who's sitting next to you, which room you're in, what date it is. You do know what that is. So this is where they're talking about divided attention in the sense that you are still aware, even though you're not particularly paying attention to it. That's what divided attention is. Okay? And that finishes off what the entirety of this .1.1 that you need to know. I have put in some exam questions here for you to have a go. I'm just going to play the video, give you some time to take some notes, and then we'll do the exam questions together just about maybe 10-15 minutes before the end. Okay? So I'm going to play this video over here. Let's see, you guys can choose which one. Would you like to hear the philosophical perspective or would you like to hear the biological perspective? Hands up for philosophical. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. That sounds like more than half already. Okay, cool. All right. Let's go with philosophical. In a philosophical approach, they want to talk about why is it important to understand what consciousness is and how that can apply or change the world, essentially.
Why people are choosing this 100.
So it's trying to understand the idea of why would we need to know what consciousness is? Does it even matter to know if it's separate or it's the same as your body? Why does it matter? And this particular speaker talks about John Searle. He talks about consciousness and his understanding.
139 Australian dollars drone over established drone brands. There's a
I'm going to talk about consciousness. Why consciousness? Well, it's a curiously neglected subject, both in our scientific and our philosophical culture. Why is that curious? Well, it is the most important aspect of our lives for a very simple logical reason. Namely, it's a necessary condition on anything being important in our lives that we're conscious. You care about science, philosophy, music, art, whatever. It's no good if you're a zombie or in a coma, right? So consciousness is number one. The second reason is that when people do get interested in it, as I think they should, they tend to say the most appalling things. And then even when they're not saying appalling things, they're really trying to do serious research. Well, it's been slow. Progress has been slow. When I first got interested in this, I thought, well, it's a straightforward problem in biology. Let's get these brain stabbers to get busy and figure out how it works in the brain. So I went over to UCSF and I talked to all the heavy-duty neurobiologists there, and they showed some impatience, as scientists often do when you ask them embarrassing questions. But the thing that struck me is one guy said, an exasperated, very famous neurobiologist, he said, look, in my discipline, it's okay to be interested in consciousness, but get tenure first. Get tenure first. Now, I think I've been working on this for a long time. I think now you might actually get tenure by working on consciousness. If so, that's a real step forward. Okay, now why then is this curious reluctance and curious hostility to consciousness? Well, I think it's a combination of two features of our intellectual culture that like to think they're opposing each other, but in fact they share a common set of assumptions. One feature is the tradition of religious dualism.